Yeah, so this is, if you then turn towards, right, what are the archaeologists claiming in their dig report? They're largely going through and they're explaining this is where we excavated, and this is the type of pottery that we found, and this is where that pottery came from, because they did do things like the petrographic analysis.
Yeah.
Where did this pottery come from? Is it local?
It was the Nile and Delta Valley.
Some of it came from there. Now, some of it also came from different areas in the Aegean, and so we have Egyptian pottery that seems to have come from Egypt. And we have some Greek styles of pottery that came from the broader Aegean. So is it a local individual? This is the question of like imitation pottery. Is this just a bad imitation of these types of things? Because the pottery types themselves are not ornate. They're not fancy. They're not dress or table pottery.
And that's something the dig report really emphasized.
Yeah, they're basic types.
It'd be interesting to see that an Israelite person or someone from the area would have this very common wear of pottery.
Yeah, and it's not the kind of stuff that you would necessarily want to be copying.
Yeah.
If you're going to make a copy of something, the assumption is normally, and it may not always be true, but if you're going to make a copy, you make a copy of something fancy. I'm trying to imitate the thing that I can't go out and buy. Why am I going to make an imitation of a bad storage jar or a cheap storage jar? I have storage jars. I'll just use those. So those types of things do matter because, as they say, we don't have, before this, we haven't really had evidence of Egyptian presence at this site. We have the tradition of there's a long history with Megiddo and that it had been a site of Assyrian power in the region. But as the Assyrian power wanes, they leave this site, and it seems that through this pottery, maybe the Egyptians are coming in and establishing themselves at this place. How far in advance of Pharaoh Necho's campaigns in? That's something that's harder to tell because archaeology always works in these larger spans of time.
Yeah.
That rarely does something come in with like, oh, this is the exact date. That's not the way this stuff normally works, which is what people want it to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes what it gets described as being. But they're saying that there's this process of pottery buildup, because this is also something that happens over a long period of time. In order to have the numbers of pottery types, you have to have this development of layers and remains. And so they're identifying, okay, here in this layer, we have stuff from the late 7th century. That is seeming to indicate the presence of Egyptian and maybe Greek. They tag them as mercenaries at this site. That does align potentially with a version of how we see King Josiah's death happening, depending on what text you want to read. But the archaeologists themselves are not saying we found proof of King Josiah's death.
Yeah.
The Daily Mail, when you actually read it,
they don't claim.
They also don't claim. They want to say it to get you in.
Yeah.
They say it to come through because, right, you see it just like we did. And we say, you're saying you found what? And then we click on it and then you read it and you go, okay, so once you get a little ways in, you're backing off of that.
Yeah.
Which is understandable in the way they're trying to drive traffic. They're trying to sustain themselves.
Well, it's a big name, Josiah.
Whether they should be doing this or not, then you get into the debate of, okay, how are you using the work of the archaeologists? Are you fairly representing their work when you are saying this thing about them and then walking away? The archaeologists in their report, they do talk some about this is potentially underlying context. This is telling us a backstory that might be informing the biblical narratives. But they're not making claims about this being connected to Josiah. The Daily Mail, once they walk away, they're not really making that claim either because they can't.
No.
They can't actually say, I mean, they could. They could go out on a limb.
What would it be? The evidence, the pottery, how would that prove it?
How would pottery prove it? You'd have to have something that is an inscription, that something is written down. Although there will still then be the debate of, okay, well, if this is a text that says this, does that prove the version that we have in Kings? Does that prove the version that we have in Chronicles? Is this a political retelling? We have lots of inscriptions from Egypt where a pharaoh is saying, I have eradicated all of these people groups. And then we have more inscriptions describing the existence of those people groups. Okay, so we have a text that says someone did a thing and then proof that. So the text isn't always a one-to-one, whether it's a boasting, whether it's a figurative description of what happened. So even if we had something written down on one of these pieces of pottery, is that then proof of what we have? I mean, not really. It's stuff you can use to try to contextualize what we have happening in Kings and Chronicles, but that's a point within this that, again, the archaeologists point to. If there's a diversity within the biblical text, a disagreement within the biblical text of how Josiah died, and the context of what is happening that leads Josiah to be here at all, which is another debate that happens within this.